Today we're going to be testing out the Vivo X300 Pro, Omar's best smartphone camera of the year last year, to the S26 Ultra to see which one is better. I know you're rolling. Cut that out. Let's start with the first section, the ultra-wide. The ultra-wide photo on the S26 Ultra retains a really clean and sharp edges around the photo, whereas on the Vivo X300 Pro, you can see a little bit of fuzziness in the details when you zoom in on the edges of the photos. However, both looks really good in terms of optical warping.
Remember guys, one thing about street photography is you cannot be shy to get the angle.
The Vivo X300 Pro also has bokeh and ultra wide, which sometimes can fail, as you can see in this photo where it's trying to focus more on the foreground as opposed to the subject of the image, which I don't have a problem with the S26 Ultra because it doesn't really have any form of blur, making the entire image well focused. In terms of color profiles, it's kind of the same as earlier where the X300 Pro leans to a warmer tone compared to the S26 Ultra, whereas the S26 Ultra keeping things true to life. The saturation and vibrance on the X300 Pro is also higher than the S26 Ultra, creating a more punchy image. Interestingly, the image on the S26 Ultra is brighter than the X300 Pro, which is the opposite of what we saw in the main camera. The shadows on the X300 Pro is darker than the S26 Ultra, and the highlights are brighter on the S26 Ultra with a slight bloom and halo compared to the X300 Pro. Bring me down. Oh, I want to say something. Whoa. A bit intimate there, sorry. It's a cloudy day, so the photos aren't going to look very cinematic. We'll see how these two handle cloudy day photography. Next, let's move on to the main camera. The Vivo X300 Pro increases the shadows and highlights in an image to make it appear brighter, which sometimes can be really pleasant, but also it could push the highlights a bit too much, resulting in a bloom around the highlights of a picture. The Vivo X300 leans to a warmer tone as compared to the S26 Ultra, which leads to the X26 Ultra's white and grays looking a little bit more green than the Vivo X300. Now when it comes to the vibrance and saturation, the Vivo X300 Pro increases the vibrancy and saturation of all the photos that it's taken, making it feel a bit more lively as compared to the S26 Ultra, which leans more towards the more natural and real-to-life looking photos. What I'm immediately noticing from the color processing on these two phones is that the X300 Pro doesn't process colors as well as the S26 Ultra. It's a lot fuzzier and it's leaning towards purple. When we take a look at this example with the fruits, we can see that the fruits on the S26 Ultra does look more natural than the X300 Pro, which seems like it's just over-saturated and over-vibrant. The details in the mangosteen on the S26 Ultra look similar to how it looked like in real life, but on the X300 Pro, it just looks like it's not the right color. For example, when we took a look at the antenna of this building, the windows where it's reflecting the sun, there's a slight halo and bloom on the highlights, whereas on the S26 Ultra, you can't really see it. With more vibrance and saturation, the yellows in the Vivo X300 is a bit brighter and more saturated than the S26 Ultra. This is so interesting. Usually you don't see half an arch when you're walking around Malaysia. But look at this, dude. I'm the top fin of a shark. Next up we have the telephoto. The exposure differences that we're seeing between the S26 Ultra and the Vivo X300 Pro is somewhat similar to the main camera sensor, where the X300 Pro processes the images with more contrast and a slightly better look than the S26 Ultra, with the highlights being brighter on the X300 Pro compared to the S26 Ultra, and the shadows being retained in the S26 Ultra compared to the X300 Pro. I'm seeing a pattern with how the S26 Ultra is processing their images. They're trying to retain as much information on the S26 Ultra as much as possible. Therefore, the highlights aren't blown out and the shadows aren't blown out, making a clear, consistent, and well-balanced image. What's interesting is that the telephoto lens starts on the 3.5x on the X300 Pro, but it starts on the 3x on the S26 Ultra. So I kinda have to zoom in a little bit on the S26 Ultra, so apologies if some of the focal length is a bit off. But I'll try to keep it as accurate as possible. I have to do this so well, if not, the comment sections will always be so mad at me. What X are you taking that picture with? What X? Girl, look at the photo! Oh my god! Now, because the X300 Pro has a higher contrast, that does create this moody and atmospheric look, which some people might be into. Again, with the color profile, the Vivo X300 Pro has a warmer color tone on the telephoto sensor compared to the S26 Ultra, which tries to keep it as natural and real-life looking as possible. And then on the X300 Pro telephoto, you can see that there's a little bit of bokeh, whereas the S26 Ultra doesn't have any bokeh, which is good to know. There's a little blooming effect in the background here with the X300 Pro, whereas the S26 Ultra looks closer to life and looks like it's real textures. The hair on the woman looks slightly too smooth on the X300 Pro compared to the S26 Ultra, which I prefer the S26 Ultra because I don't want my images to look ultra processed. However, the Vivo X300 Pro does do a better job when it comes to taking pictures of random objects from far away. At 240mm, the images of these lanterns look so much better on the X300 Pro with clear edge separation, great exposure, quite a balanced exposure between the shadows and the highlights. It's a really good image.
And now we do portraits.
The beautifying filter on the X300 Pro is so obvious compared to the S26 Ultra. They whitened the skin tones and they reddened the lips to make it look like she's wearing a lipstick, and it's a little bit unpleasant because the hair is smoothened out compared to the S26 Ultra. It looks too AI processed, and it's a lot more obvious when you go into Ultra Telephoto or Ultra Zoom, where it just looks like a completely different person. Her skin tone is completely different, her lips are different color, and the details in the background are completely over-processed to look ultra smooth. One unfortunate thing on Samsung's side is the shutter lag that exists when you press the shutter button. In this photo, I moved the phone immediately after pressing the shutter button, creating this effect because the phone doesn't have enough time to process the image. But the X300 Pro doesn't have this issue, so I don't really have to worry about blurry images because it captures in real time. I think the S26 Ultra really nails it. The color profiling is a bit warmer than the S300 Pro, but it's closer to real life from what I remember. But they're both still pretty good, and I still prefer the S26 Ultra because there's just barely any beautifying filter happening on my subject's face.
So while we're out here, we're going to test out the low light capabilities for these two phones in here. As you can see, as we're moving in, it gets really dark. We'll see how well these two do. So although this is not technically nighttime photography because it's light outside, this is good enough to test out the low light photography capabilities for these two phones because it's quite dark in here. And then we can see how it processes shadows and highlights together in a really difficult lighting environment.
These two phones approach low-light photos really differently. The X300 Pro approaches it with a more atmospheric and moody processing, whereas the S26 Ultra tries to retain as much information as possible. That means the shadows in the S26 Ultra is being lifted and the highlights on the S26 Ultra is being pushed higher, whereas the X300 Pro kind of retains how this scene would look like in real life. When we take a closer look at the neon sign here, we can see that the tubes are well contained and the color of the neon sign isn't bleeding everywhere in the image. Whereas on the S26 Ultra, the colors from the neon sign is kind of bleeding onto the concrete pillar behind it. While it does look a bit brighter, it's not as pleasing or as realistic as it is on the X300 Pro. The color processing on both phones is also visible here in low light, where we can see the X300 Pro is a bit cooler than the S26 Ultra, and the edges on the X300 Pro is a bit cleaner than the S26 Ultra, which is slightly fuzzy and slightly noisy. The X300 Pro handles noise incredibly well. There's almost no visible noise in this picture right here, and the details in the textures are well preserved, whereas on the S26 Ultra, when you zoom in, you can clearly see some noise happening, making it a bit of a muddy image here and there. I guess they're trying to keep as much information as possible, which also means they have to bump up the noise levels in order to preserve some of the shadows.
If you've seen a lot of my videos, you know I love sitting next to this lady. She's pretty cool. She's here every time I come here, so it's quite nice.
We're seeing the same patterns in video performances on the X300 Pro, where the shadows are brighter than the S26 Ultra, as well as the highlights. It's a bit brighter on the X300 Pro compared to the 26 Ultra. What's interesting to me, I think, is that the S26 Ultra seems to be slightly more saturated.
I'm at the point in the day when my hands are super shaky, so this is the perfect time to test out the stabilization on these two videos.
But what surprised me the most was the stabilization on the S26 Ultra was really bad. At this point in time, I was really hungry, so my hands were really shaking, and I thought the S26 Ultra could handle the shakiness, but it just failed. However, when I turn on the horizon lock, it kind of fixes all the jitter problem that I had with the footage. The Vivo X300 Pro does have a super steady mode on, and with that turned on, it's even more stable than the horizon lock, so well done Vivo. Log footage on both phones look extremely good, but they both approach colors and exposures differently. The Vivo X300 Pro is more saturated after applying a LUT, and it's a lot more moody, so I had to change the exposures a little bit to match it with the Samsung. Which the Samsung is a bit more balanced. There's not a lot of saturation going on after applying a LUT, which I really appreciate because it means I have more flexibility in coloring my scene after applying a LUT.
As always, thank you so much for watching. Let us know which phones you prefer and what comparisons you want to see next. See you in the next one.